Talks top of mind, South Florida farmers say they're in trouble. Crops are rotting on the vine, and they're blaming the ongoing trade wars and immigration changes.
What does this mean for the future of our food? The Night Team's Heather Walker has a look at Tonight 7 Investigates.
Of farmers in Arkansas gathered at a town hall last week to ask Congress for help. Mounting debt, aging equipment, and disappearing profits are making it nearly impossible for them to break even, let alone to turn a profit. One of those farmers calls the president's tariffs, quote, the ice cream on top of a cake of a perfect storm.
What if I told you that Africa just made a food deal so big that Washington is quietly panicking? A deal that could change who controls the future of global agriculture, and America is not happy about it. China has stepped into Africa's farmland with billions of dollars, building irrigation systems, modern farms, grain warehouses, and long-term food supply lines, and for the first time ever. Africa isn't just exporting raw food, it's becoming a strategic food partner. But here's where the controversy starts. China's growing influence over African crops, seeds, fertilizer, and even food processing is something America did not expect. U.S. officials are warning that Beijing is gaining dangerous control over Africa's food security. But African leaders say America is only angry because it's losing its influence. So who's telling the truth? Is China really helping Africa grow? Or is America just afraid of losing power? Today, we break down the real reasons why this new Africa-China food alliance is shaking America to its core. Africa is entering a new era, an era where food, land, and agriculture are no longer just domestic issues but global power tools shaping the future of nations. And right at the center of this major shift is a partnership that has stunned Washington and shaken policymakers in the United States. Africa's rapidly growing food partnership with China. A partnership so unexpected, so large, and so influential that it has triggered real anger and concern in America. To understand why the U.S. is reacting this strongly, we need to look far deeper into how food has become the new battlefield of global power and why Africa's decision to strengthen ties with China is changing the balance of that power. For decades, Africa's agriculture has been globally undervalued. Western nations saw the continent mostly as a supplier of raw crops like cocoa, cotton, palm oil, cashew, maize, and sometimes livestock. But they never invested in helping Africa become a full agricultural power on its own. The United States, in particular, focused more on trade rules, aid programs, and political conditions rather than real agricultural development. Africa became a place where America would buy cheap crops without investing in food processing, fertilizer plants, grain storage, or large-scale irrigation systems that could transform the continent. But China approached Africa with an entirely different strategy. Instead of just buying raw goods, China began building the infrastructure to change how Africa grows food entirely. Beijing funded irrigation canals in East Africa, introduced hybrid rice and maize varieties in West Africa, built large grain warehouses in Southern Africa, and helped set up fertilizer factories in countries like Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia. To many African leaders, this wasn't just business, it was transformation, and that transformation has now grown to a scale that makes America very uncomfortable. The United States is watching Africa and China build a food partnership that reaches into almost every agricultural sector. Seeds, crops, cattle, poultry, storage, transportation, processing, and export logistics. China is deeply embedding itself in Africa's food supply chain, not just as a buyer, but as a partner. And this is where the U.S. feels threatened because America knows that whoever controls the world's food supply chains holds massive global influence. Food is power. Food is stability. Food is national security. And Africa, with its 60% of the world's remaining uncultivated arable land, is the last frontier of global agriculture. China saw this early, America did not. Today, Chinese companies farm millions of acres across Africa. They fund irrigation projects that allow African farmers to grow all year round instead of only during rainy seasons. Chinese-built roads and railways help African crops move to ports faster. Chinese agronomists train African farmers in new farming techniques. Chinese seed centers across Africa produce improved rice varieties that double yields. Every single one of these moves strengthens China's position in Africa and weakens America's. Washington sees this as a geopolitical threat, not just an economic one. The U.S. fears that China is gaining too much influence over Africa's food system. Some American officials even warn that China could control Africa's food security in the future. But African governments push back, saying that America is only angry because it's losing influence. For decades, the U.S. had the opportunity to help Africa build strong agriculture. But America chose a different path, more political talk than practical investment. China stepped in and filled the vacuum. This is what makes the U.S. furious. Africa's agricultural future is now deeply tied to Beijing, not Washington. and the partnership extends into strategic crops like rice, maize, wheat, sugar, soybeans, sorghum, and millet. These are not small crops, they are the heart of global food supply. China's food security strategy depends heavily on external sources. With 1.4 billion people to feed, China cannot depend only on its own land. It needs stable, long-term agricultural partnerships abroad. Africa is the perfect fit: huge land, a growing workforce, fertile soil, and governments eager for investment. But for America, this is alarming. The U.S. has always considered food influence a major geopolitical tool. America exports wheat, corn, soybeans, and other grains to countries around the world. That trade gives the U.S. serious leverage in global politics. If any country depends heavily on U.S. food, America can influence their decisions. But now Africa is slowly reducing its agricultural dependence on the United States while strengthening its ties with China. The U.S. is not just angry because China is investing in Africa. It's angry because Africa is becoming stronger without needing America. This frustration became clear when U.S. officials warned African nations about taking Chinese agricultural loans, claiming that China would trap Africa in debt. But African leaders argue that Western nations had decades to help build agricultural power but didn't. Instead, they focused on aid programs and charity. China, on the other hand, is building dams, irrigation systems, grain silos, and roads. Africans see the difference. To them, China is helping the continent grow food and export more. America is warning from the sidelines, and warnings don't build farms. One of the biggest reasons America is angry is the new Africa-China Food Corridor agreements. These partnerships allow China to buy African crops directly at large volumes. China is now purchasing African rice, cashews, sesame, soybeans, avocados, beef, and even fish. The volume is growing every year. African agricultural exports to China have surged beyond expectations, and the U.S. doesn't like what that means for global trade because it threatens America's dominance in world food markets. China is also doing something that the U.S. never prioritized: investing in local food processing. Instead of Africa exporting raw goods and losing billions in value, China is helping countries build processing plants, rice mills, cashew factories, sugar refineries, and maize processors. When Africa processes its own food, the continent earns far more money. America understands that processed food markets are extremely profitable. If Africa becomes a global food processing hub, the U.S. loses economic influence not only in Africa but in global trade. Another reason for American anger is the shift in agricultural research. China has opened agricultural research centers in over 20 African countries. These centers develop seeds, study soil, improve crop resilience, and train farmers. This strengthens Africa's agricultural independence. For America, that means Africa is no longer a region to sell seeds to, it becomes a region that can create its own. That is a direct threat to U.S. agricultural companies who make billions selling seeds and fertilizers worldwide. China also built technological farming systems across Africa: drone farming, soil sensors, remote irrigation, digital mapping of farms, and smart greenhouses. These innovations help African farmers increase yields dramatically. American analysts say China is creating an influence so deep that it will shape Africa's agricultural direction for the next 50 years. If China helps Africa become a food powerhouse, then China gains long-term strategic friends and partners. America fears being left out, but what truly angers the U.S. is Africa's new confidence. African nations are now choosing who to partner with based on real benefits, not pressure. They're saying no to political conditions. They're saying no to one-sided trade. They're saying yes to development that produces results. And for many African governments, China is delivering those results. America is not used to Africa having this level of independence. The U.S. also worries that African countries may begin to prioritize China in food exports, giving China more control over future global food prices. For America, this is not just an economic concern, it's a national security concern. Food supplies are global leverage, and China gaining influence threatens America's long-term power. But the truth is that Africa is not just choosing China over the U.S. Africa is choosing whoever helps the continent rise. African farmers themselves have become some of the strongest supporters of the partnership with China. They see real changes on the ground: affordable fertilizers, higher crop yields, modern farming equipment, improved seeds, and access to markets that actually buy their goods. To farmers who were ignored for decades, the China partnership feels like progress. And when American diplomats warn them about China, they feel insulted because they believe America had every chance to help and didn't. African countries want food sovereignty. They want to grow enough food, feed their people, and export on their own terms. China is simply the country willing to invest in that vision. America is angry because it sees Africa slipping away not as a political partner, but as an agricultural force it can no longer influence. This is the real story. Africa's new food partnership with China is not just an economic alliance. It is a symbol of Africa rising, Africa choosing, and Africa building its own future. And for the first time in decades, Africa is in control of a resource more powerful than oil or gold: food. A resource the world desperately needs. A resource that gives Africa more leverage than ever before. America knows this. China knows this. And Africa is using that knowledge to reshape its destiny. This partnership is making America angry, not because China is investing, but because Africa is finally stepping into global power. The US is losing influence, China is gaining ground, and Africa is rising in the middle. The future of global agriculture will be shaped by this new triangle of power. But for now, one thing is clear. Africa's new food partnership with China is no longer just a trade deal. It is a geopolitical earthquake, one that America can feel and one that the world will soon have to respect. As we close this investigation into Africa's new food partnership with China, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The world is changing. And Africa is no longer the silent observer in the backseat of global politics. For decades, powerful nations shaped Africa's agricultural future without ever allowing Africa to shape its own. But now, for the first time, the continent is choosing its partners based on value, investment, respect, and real development rather than pressure, politics, or foreign instructions. China's entrance into Africa's agricultural space didn't just shift trade routes, it shifted relationships, it shifted mindsets, it shifted power. And perhaps that is why America is reacting so strongly, not because Africa is doing anything wrong, but because Africa is finally doing something different, something independent, something bold, something that challenges the long-standing global order. Africa is no longer waiting for permission to rise. It's rising with or without Western approval. And as China continues to fund irrigation systems, build grain silos, invest in seeds, train farmers, and expand processing factories across the continent, Africa's agricultural future becomes richer and more stable. For many African leaders, this partnership represents something they have not seen in decades: a chance to actually become food secure, export at scale, and earn real value from their land. But what makes this moment even more powerful is the shift in perspective among African farmers themselves. Across villages, towns, and cities, farmers are acknowledging that the world finally recognizes the continent's agricultural potential. They understand that global powers are now competing not to control Africa but to work with Africa. That alone is historic, and whether it is China offering infrastructure or America offering warnings, Africa is now in a position to decide its own path. The anger coming out of Washington is not just geopolitical, it's emotional. For years, the United States believed Africa's agricultural sector would remain an open field for American companies, American seeds, American fertilizers, and American influence. But now, with China rising as a strategic partner, that assumption has been shattered. And the ripple effect won't stop at agriculture. It will extend into trade, investment, alliances, and global diplomacy. Africa is no longer just the battleground. Africa is the prize, the partner, and the power. And the most important part is that Africa is learning to use its land as leverage. The continent holds 60% of the world's untapped arable land. In a global future where food scarcity will be more dangerous than oil scarcity, Africa becomes the center of gravity. The US knows this. China knows this. Even Europe knows this. The world is turning toward Africa not because of charity, but because of necessity. As we move forward, the question becomes, who will Africa trust? Who will help Africa grow? Who will respect Africa's decisions? And who will stand with Africa not just when it's convenient, but when it's necessary? America still wants influence. China still wants partnership. But Africa now wants something greater: control over its own destiny. This story is not about who is right or wrong. It is not about choosing sides between East or West. It is about Africa finally standing tall at the center of a global transformation. A continent long exploited for its resources is now negotiating from a position of strength. A continent once ignored in agricultural strategy is now shaping the world's food future. A continent once viewed as dependent is rising as independent. The anger in America is simply a reaction to this new reality. Africa is moving. Africa is evolving. Africa is choosing. And whether the world likes it or not, Africa is becoming one of the most important agricultural players of the 21st century. If this partnership with China continues to grow, America will have no choice but to rethink how it approaches the continent, not with threats, warnings, or political conditions, but with genuine respect and real investment. Because Africa has options now. Africa has bargaining power. Africa has a voice, and that voice is becoming louder. So as the global spotlight turns toward this new Africa-China food alliance, one message echoes across the continent. Africa is not the farmland of foreign powers. Africa is the farmland of Africans, a farmland that can feed the world. A farmland that can generate wealth. A farmland that can transform millions of lives. The future of agriculture belongs to Africa, and the world is just beginning to realize it. Thank you for watching. If you want more powerful stories exposing the truth behind Africa's rise, hit the like button, subscribe, and join us again as we continue to uncover the real battles shaping our world today.